Welcome everyone to this Monash Cybersecurity Seminar. Today we are delighted to welcome Ittay, who is a senior lecturer in electrical and computer engineering faculty at Technion. He completed his PhD at Technion, followed by a postdoctorate at Cornell University. And Dr. Eyal was awarded a 2018 Alum Scholarship and a 2022 Krill Prize. And his research focuses mainly on performance and security in decentralized systems, including blockchain, which is also the topic for his talk today. He will be talking to us about blockchain security by incentives. I'll stop sharing. Thank you, Ittay, for your talk, and you can go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation and introduction. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
All right. Decentralized systems. So decentralized systems like cryptocurrencies and smart contract platforms are being rapidly developed and deployed. Unlike classical systems, their security relies on incentives. And we are still tackling basic questions on how to reason about and how to analyze such systems. This talk will focus on the unique challenges in securing decentralized systems. Particularly our most recent results, that is actually this is the first presentation of it, that significantly improves the state of the art in resilient blockchain protocols. The talk will be completely self-contained. So first of all, decentralized systems, we're talking about cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Zcash. They are blockchain-based and they allow you to move a virtual token that is maintained on these systems. Also, decentralized finance mechanisms, the DeFi we're hearing about, and in particular variant of this are non-fungible tokens, where you trade virtual assets on top of a blockchain. Now, we're not going to deal in the majority of this talk with applications, but rather with the security of those systems. And the security here relies on incentives, and incentives apply to at two different levels. First of all, the consensus protocol, which will be the majority of the talk, but also for admission control, for realizing which transactions should be placed in the system and which should be delayed. Our plan for today, I'll start with some background on how decentralized blockchains work, in particular proof of work blockchains. Then I'll start with selfish mining, the original attack that showed that we need to think about incentives, and then optimal selfish mining mechanisms that show how secure the systems actually are. Then I'll present this recent result called colordag. I'll talk about the previous state of the art called Fruitchain for resilient blockchain architectures, and then present colordag and the game theoretical reasoning that motivates it. And finally, if time allows, I'll discuss some more questions, both on the consensus level incentives and on smart contract level incentives. So we'll start with background. The proof of work blockchain introduced by the pseudonymous Satoshi Nakamoto in 2008 in the famous white paper, and with a subsequent implementation in 2009 that led to the ecosystem we know today. So the blockchain implements a replicated state machine. We're essentially deploying a log of transactions. These are orders, operations created by users. You see the users Alice, Bob, and Carol at the bottom, and they wish to enter their transactions to this log. So Alice sends money from her account A1 to Bob's account B1, and then Bob would like to send this money from his account B1 to Carol's account C1, and so on. And all these operations enter the log. Note that all operations globally enter the same single log. And this log is maintained by a distributed set of machines spread all over the internet. And the reason we want to place everything on a single log is to prevent something like this, a double spending, where Alice tries to send this money to Bob from her account A1, but she also sends the same money from her account A1 to another one of her accounts A2. And since we place everything on a log, we can immediately identify that the second transaction is illegal because it conflicts with the first transaction. So we need everything in a log. To be more efficient, rather than approving one transaction at a time, they are batched into blocks. Each block contains many transactions, and the order of the log is derived from the order of the blocks. To define the order of the blocks, each block contains a header, metadata, that includes the summary of the transactions and also a hash pointer to the previous block. And now from the order, and now we have an order of the blocks, and from that an order of the transactions. And we're not going to care anymore at this point about the transactions, so we'll represent blocks as simple squares. And what I want to do now is talk about the incentives. So why would entities create such blocks? So the entities that create the block need to solve a puzzle. And the puzzles are hard to solve, and they take a random time. The time to solve a puzzle is exponentially distributed, and the system takes care to keep it constant. So first of all, because the puzzles are take exponential time to solve, we can see that the ratio of blocks each miner will create, the miners are the participants generating the blocks, yes. So the ratio of blocks is proportional to each miner's computational power. The more computational power a miner invests, the more blocks on average it will get to generate. And the difficulty of the puzzles is determined according to the rate of the blocks. The system tries to maintain a constant rate of blocks. For Ethereum, it's one block every 15 seconds. For Bitcoin, it's one block every 10 minutes. And in order to do that, if blocks are generated too quickly, meaning more participants use more mining power, more computational power to generate blocks, the system automatically increases the difficulty, so blocks are harder to generate, and so they will take longer to generate, and the difficulty is set such that the interval between blocks goes to the desired average. And the other way also works. So if less participants generate blocks, then the system will automatically reduce the difficulty, and so fewer participants will be able to generate blocks at the desired rate. Now, this random process leads to a problem. While we want blocks to be generated one at a time, each referencing the previous one, at occasion, we may get two blocks referencing the same parent. Now, this is not the result of any attack. This is a natural occurrence due to the distributed nature of the system. We have a network of machines spread all over the internet. And if you see here, the blue machine generates a blue block, and the information of this blue block propagates through the network. And before it arrives at the green node, that green node was lucky to solve the puzzle and generate its own green block. And so now we have two blocks with the same parent. And once the information propagates, everybody knows that this is the state now. And our question is, what is the log? We said the log is derived from the order of the blocks, but now we have two blocks at the end. So we need to decide which transactions are in the log and which are not. And to do that, Nakamoto said that the longest chain wins. Actually, the chain with the most, the hardest puzzles solved, the most work spent. But longest chain is a good approximation, a good intuition. The idea is that once a miner sees a fork, two branches, it will mine on the longer chain. So once one of the chains becomes longer, all miners are going to extend it, and the blocks on the other side, on the branch, are going to be just ignored. Their transactions do not apply, and there is no reward. Now, the ledger desiderata, the specification, what we want to achieve from the ledger was actually formalized years after Nakamoto by a Garayan company and later by a Passon company. And it includes three requirements. First of all, naturally, consistency. Consistency means that two things, really. First of all, nodes agree with each other. So two nodes will agree on the ledger. Maybe not the very end of the ledger, because there might be forks, but if you go some constant time backwards, they agree on everything that happened until that time. And also, once this state until that time stabilized, it will not change. So the consistency over time. Second requirement is growth. We want the ledger to be extended at some linear rate, bounded from below by some linear rate. And finally, quality. We want a bounded rate of honest transactions. So if you look at a portion of the ledger, it should include some ratio of transactions generated by honest miners. We can translate that to a bounded rate of blocks. And starting from Nakamoto and until today, this is still a very much active area of research. There is a study of the security of a blockchain and blockchains like this under the assumption that the majority of participants follow the protocol. Are there questions?
There is none in the Q&A so far.
Okay, so I will go on and maybe put, if there are questions or comments, maybe you can put them in the chat, and I'll take time to respond. So far, we did not talk really about incentives. So let's talk about incentives. So this starts with our paper, Gun Sir at Cornell at the time, and me, called Majority is Not Enough. And this follows from this simple observation. On the left here, you see the model that we used so far. So if everybody else is honest, then a minority attacker cannot violate safety. Intuitively, the minority attacker cannot run faster than the honest participants. So it cannot generate a fork that will run faster than the honest participants. But this is not the same as saying what's on the right here, which is that if everybody else is honest, then a minority player should or is motivated to be honest. And this is what we're asking. So this is, in essence, Nash equilibrium, right? We're asking, if everybody else is honest, what is my best response? Should I really be honest? And to answer this question, we will try to develop an algorithm where the attacker or rational player really tries to get more than their fair share. The first question is really more what. So we consider the rewards as constant. So there's actually some variability, and we'll get to that maybe later on today, but we're going to treat, for our purposes now, each block as a constant reward. And what the rational miner wants to do is maximize its revenue, and they will translate this to the average number of blocks until over time, as time goes to infinity. So how are we going to share this? The intuition is the following. The attacker, again, the rational player, is going to try to generate blocks and keep them secret, not publish the new blocks that it generated. And it will keep them secret and publish them at the exact right time in order to maximize its utility. And the intuition is that the attacker is going to risk some of the work. Sometimes it's going to lose, but in total, it's going to improve its situation. The others are going to waste a lot of effort, a lot of work. So let's dive in. What the attacker tries to do is to form a secret branch. At first, I hope you can see my laser pointer here. At first, if this is the end of the chain and the attacker generates a block, he generates this block and it's dashed, meaning it's secret, it's red, meaning it's the attacker's. Or if the attacker already has some secret blocks and creates a new secret block, it keeps this one secret as well. Now, the secret chain is not going to be maintained forever since we are looking at a minority attacker. And because it's a minority, the honest parties, the majority, are going to create their branch faster. And so eventually they will keep up. And once this block is generated by the honest parties, the attacker knows that this is going to close to lose its advantage. And so he publishes his last two blocks that were kept secret. And now the attacker's chain is longer. And if the attacker's chain is longer, the honest blocks here are going to be simply ignored. Everybody, including the honest parties, will keep extending this chain. Now, this is the goal of the attack, but what might happen is that the attacker generates this secret block, and then the honest parties publish their block before the attacker managed to obtain an advantage. And in this situation, what the attacker does is immediately publish his secret block. And now both blocks are public and we have a race. And the result of the race depends on the attacker's network presence. We're not going to deal with how the attacker can do this, but we'll mark this as gamma. This is the attacker's rushing power. So the result of this race can be one of three. First, the honest parties can extend their own block. This is fine. Second, the honest parties might extend the attacker's block. This would happen if the attacker was rushing. So we say that if the honest parties created a block with probability gamma, they will extend the attacker's block, and with probability 1 minus gamma, they will extend their own block. So a more rushing adversary has less risk. In particular, if gamma equals 1, we will always get this. So the attacker takes no risk. His block will never be lost. And finally, if the attacker creates the next block, he immediately publishes it, and we start again. This is the attack. To analyze it, we're going to use, or maybe first, why is this even good? So the attacker loses blocks when he does this. So when the attack succeeds and he manages to obtain an advantage, then he loses nothing, it's great. But at times he is going to lose some blocks. And why is this? So why is the revenue better for the attacker in this case? And the answer comes from the difficulty tuning we've talked about. So the system maintains a constant average interval between blocks, but let's be a bit more specific. The system maintains a constant average interval between blocks on the main chain. So blocks that were forked are not accounted for the difficulty adjustment and for the block interval, meaning that the attacker's actual revenue, the utility we care about, the tokens per month, are the attacker's ratio of the blocks on the chain divided by the total number of blocks on the chain. And so what the attacker really cares about is his ratio of blocks on the main chain. So if he loses some blocks and the honest parties lose a lot of blocks, the attacker's revenue, actual revenue per month, this is the utility we care about, it grows. Now the analysis I'm not going into in detail, but it's based on a Markov chain. Each state in the Markov analysis will describe the advantage of the attacker, how many blocks it is ahead. And the transitions are based on the probability that the attacker generates a block. In particular, if this 0 prime is the race situation, after a race, we always go back to a single head of the chain, single final block of the chain, but it can be due to one of 3 different cases. From this chain, we can calculate the probabilities of the different states. And then for each transition, we can account for the parties' revenues, the honest and the attacker revenues. And here's the issue. The revenue or the utility of the attacker grows superlinearly. You see here the attacker size, her mining power out of the total, and this grows up to 1/2. We're only interested in minority attackers. And on the y-axis, you see the relative revenue or the utility. And the gray line here is the honest algorithm. So if you follow the rules, you get exactly your fair share. This is because of the exponential puzzles. But if you use selfish mining, in all cases, whatever gamma is, the revenue grows faster than linear. Now, at some point, in all cases, even with gamma equals 0, we see that it crosses the line with the correct behavior. For gamma equals 0, it's here. For gamma equals 1, it's 0 because there's no risk. But anyway, it grows superlinearly. What does that mean? It means that if there is a rational selfish miner here, the selfish miner wants to grow. So it wants to accept more mining power and grow on this line, because it means that as you go right, you get more revenue per mining power unit. And so a selfish mining coalition would like to accept more members into its into the group, and so get even more revenue per mining power unit. And of course, miners outside the system, they prefer to join because they will get more than if they do not. And this is dangerous because the selfish coalition should grow towards 50%. And once it hits 50%, then all bets are off, because recall that the very security of the system relies on the fact that a majority follows the protocol. And the big bottom line out of this is that, first of all, even with no network presence, so gamma equals 0, the threshold for an attack is 1/3. So we need 2/3 honest party to motivate the rest, more than 2/3 honest parties to motivate the rest to follow the protocol. And if the attacker is rushing, if gamma equals 1, then the threshold is essentially 0. We can, and Ethereum actually did, change the decision rule in case of a fork. So in case of a fork with equal size, you choose uniformly at random. This means that the network presence does not affect the algorithm anymore, and it puts the threshold at it puts gamma at 0.5, and then the threshold at 1/4. If Bitcoin uses depends on network behavior, and so the threshold for Bitcoin is somewhere between 0 and 1/3. Now, this is a negative result. This is only a bound. We did not talk about yet about where the system is safe. So let's do that. Optimal selfish mining. Optimal selfish mining was first analyzed by Sapir-Stein, Sompolinsky, and Zohar in 2017. And their approach was the following. They say, this is a Markov chain with decisions. Let's solve it as a Markov decision process. The state of the Markov decision process is the chain length difference plus another bit I don't want to get into here. And the actions of the players are to adopt, meaning to follow the longer chain, to abandon, meaning if you have some blocks, just forget about them, to reveal a longer chain in order to take advantage, and so on. Now, the catch with analyzing this is that the utility of this Markov decision process is nonlinear. Because as I said, we care about the ratio of rewards rather than just the count of rewards. So what they do there is they optimize a parameterized linear utility. They define a linear utility function. This can be optimized as an MDP with classical techniques, and they optimize this. And what they show is that they can do a binary search for the parameter of this linear utility function and find the optimum of the linear utility function such that the parameter is results in the same solution of the linear utility as the ratio utility. And this allows them to find the actual optimum, which is a bit below 25%, as we saw below. So the original selfish mining was pretty close, but you can do better, especially if you're close to the threshold, which is the important point. Now, this is my student, Ray Bartzur, and he asked, what about more complex systems? So with more complex systems, this might not work. And the first step to analyze more complex systems was to take a different approach for solving the MDP. And we call this probabilistic termination optimization. Intuitively, we stop the optimization after an average number of blocks, this horizon. The longer the horizon is, the more accurate the result. And what's important here, and this is what overcomes the nonlinear utility, is that forked blocks do not count for getting closer to the horizon. Only if we extend the chain, we get a probability of restarting. And we show that solving this single MDP converges to the optimal result in Bitcoin if the horizon is long enough. And this is quicker than the previous work, and it actually allows us to find a new bound for optimal selfish mining in Ethereum. Now, the whole point of this is that this enables solving larger state spaces, because once the state space and the action space become too large, the standard techniques don't allow us to find the optimum. But PTO, this probabilistic termination optimization, is amenable to reinforcement learning because it is accurate. And this allowed us to analyze a blockchain with varying rewards for the first time. So what we consider is we look at rewards coming, and this is now I'm departing a bit from the model we've talked about so far, and we look into the blocks and see the rewards in them. So as I mentioned, there is a reward per block, but the transactions entering the block also send a fee to the miner that put them in the block. And some transactions, as it is well known, we also saw statistically, some transactions provide much larger rewards than common. And so we get occasionally what's called whale transactions with a larger fee. And this can affect the consensus decisions. Now, analyzing this is a bit tricky because the fees appear based on time, not on the difficulty adjustment. So the rate is not affected by forks. They appear at a set rate due to exogenous reasons. And so, and also analyzing transactions makes the state much larger because it's not only the branch length. We actually have to remember which transactions are placed in which blocks. So the action space becomes larger. We can publish some of the transaction. The space becomes larger. We cannot solve this, find the optimal solution, and we resort to reinforcement learning. And you can see on the right here the security threshold of Bitcoin as analyzed with Whirlman, assuming the transaction rate stays the same, but the constant block reward drops. So the threshold, according to previous results, the optimal mining is at 25% because it is not affected by fees. But if we take fees into account using this analysis tool we call Whirlman, it drops quickly because these varying fee become more important for miners deciding where they want to mine. And as they become more important, miners are going to deviate. On the left here, you see a comparison with prior art, the Squirrel protocol that uses a different technique for RL, but provides less accurate results and makes it hard to analyze fees. Any questions? All right, so moving on to our main story today, I'd like to talk about stronger, more resilient blockchains that go beyond the 25% threshold. I'm going to go back to assuming all blocks have the same reward. Sorry. So more resilient blockchains. Now, the state of the art since 2017 is the pass and she algorithm called fruit chains. Fruit chain starts with a single longest chain. This is just like Nakamoto, but this chain contains no transactions. Instead, transactions are created in separate type of blocks called fruit. And these fruit, each fruit block references a block and contain these transactions. Now, the blocks themselves point to previous fruit, not to a fruit hung on the very last block, because this may change due to reorganization, due to forks, but fruit that were hung on slightly older blocks that are now going to be to remain consistent, but also not on fruit that is very old. So fruit chain does not allow you to reference in a block a fruit that was placed very long ago. And this is for chain quality. We don't want an attacker to create many fruit over time, keep them secret, and then suddenly in a block reference a lot of these old fruit. So the references to fruit that actually place them, order them in the chain are going to not allow them to go too long into the past. And the guarantee that fruit chain provides is called Epsilon Nash equilibrium, meaning an attacker, a rational player, can deviate and he can earn more than by following the rules, but it will earn at most epsilon more by deviating. So even if there is a pretty weak motivation to follow the protocol, it will be enough to overcome this epsilon, and epsilon can become as small as we desire. However, as we find, the actual deviation is both technically easy and is always better than honest mining. And the deviation is as follows. When a miner generates a block, sorry, I should have said it earlier. Let me clarify about fruit chain's incentives. So in fruit chain, revenue does not come from the blocks, but only from the fruit. And the revenue for the fruit is generated when they are referenced by a block. So a fruit has to be generated by a miner and then referenced by a block before it becomes stale for that fruit to grant a reward to its generator. And now the attack. A rational player can just reference only its own fruit and ignore all fruit generated by others. Now, this is easy to do. There's no reason not to do it. And what might happen is that some fruit by an honest party will become stale. The probability of that is small, hence the maximum epsilon benefit for deviating in this way. But if it happens, the ratio of rewards of the attacker grows. So actually every miner, no matter what its size is better off deviating this way. And if all miners behave like this, then blockchain guarantees start to fail. In other words, fruit chain is always almost a Nash equilibrium. And what we propose is to improve this with using a technique, an algorithm we call colordag. So colordag is a directed acyclic graph rather than a tree as formed in Nakamoto's blockchain. So the blocks form a DAG, direct to the cyclic graph rather than a tree. In other words, each block has not just one parent, but a few. And the idea is that each block is supposed to reference all the blocks that were not referenced earlier. The idea of using a DAG rather than a tree goes back to Levenberg, Sompolinsky, and Zohar paper from 2015. But that paper and many others use the DAG for other reasons. Here, we only use the DAG for reward calculation. This is the only point. This is not about, we're not going to talk about how we order the transactions in the DAG. We'll actually take a very simple approach, which is to take a longest chain a longest chain here. And this will be enough for us. The point is just the rewards. Now, to get the motivation correct, we're going to use 3 techniques. First thing is we want to overcome forking. If 2 honest blocks are generated at about the same time and we get a benign fork, no attack, then the attacker has an advantage. The adversary has an advantage because the adversary, if his system is well centralized, then the adversary is going to be able to generate his blocks in a series. And if the honest parties fork, they extend their chain, they create the longest chain slower. So our first step is coloring the blocks, hence the name colordag. We use NC colors. In practice, color is just a number. So for example, once a block is generated, you hash the result and you use the least significant bits to determine the color. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 16, however many colors you want. Now, once the blocks are colored, we form minors with an O minor out of the full DAG. And we do it as follows. So let's look at just the blue minor. A vertex U is in the blue minor, the blue graph. If U is blue in the full DAG, and there is an edge UV in the blue graph, if both U and V are blue, and there is a path from U to V in the full DAG, and there are no blue vertices apart from U and V in this graph. Now the implication is if we have more colors, then we have less forks, because it will be less likely that 2 blocks will be generated without a path between them. The second mechanism we're going to use is symmetric penalty. And this comes, this is necessary because of the following issue. Now that we've used colors and the probability of a fork becomes small, we know if we see a fork that it is the result with high probability of malicious behavior. However, we don't know which side is malicious, because even a not terribly large attacker can form such a fork, and then we will not be able to identify which side of the fork that is quickly resolved was generated by the attacker and which by an honest party that just did not hear of the other side. So what we do is we give him a symmetric penalty. So both parties do not get a reward for the block in the fork. And why is this useful? Recall that we're looking at the ratio of rewards. So X over Y. So if let's denote the attacker's revenue by X. Oh, I see there is a typo here. So on the right, it should be X over X plus Y. This is the attacker's reward, and assume that X is smaller than Y. Then if we give a symmetric penalty to both sides, then the attacker will get X minus D, and will get D removed from both the attacker's reward and the honest reward. And so the relative reward of the attacker will become smaller due to the symmetric penalty. Intuitively, this also works. I mean, if you are an attacker and you generate a block, that block will get you no revenue because it will get penalized. It's just an intuition. But the final step, is there a question?
Some questions, Ittay. Yeah. So here I'm a bit confused here. So in terms of the strategy, if we punish both sides, would that encourage the honest parties to kind of collaborate with the malicious ones? For example, if the attacker releases the attacker's kind of branch, then would this encourage honest parties to always follow others to avoid being punished?
Yes. So once you see, so this is exactly the motivation, actually, if I understand your point correctly. So once you see a potential conflict, you're better off extending the chain at the very end, whatever you see. So the only situation that you will be penalized is if there is a block generated at the same height as you. In every situation, you're better off by extending just the leaves.
Right. And what will be the impact of the network here? The impact of the network latency. So would that create like more natural forks, and that would potentially disincentivize miners to join the system?
Right. So thank you for this. Let me clarify. The first step is coloring, and whatever the network latency is, we can increase the number of colors to a point where in a single miner, there are hardly any forks. This is, of course, formalized, but we reduce it to hardly any forks. And from this point on, I'm talking only about a single miner with a single color. So
I see.
once we went to a single color, the probability for a fork on that single color is negligible. Does this make sense?
Yes, I see.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for these questions. That's I should have clarified that we're now talking about a single color only.
Thanks.
Can I also ask a question here? So this penalty only applies if they are at the same height, right? If you have a fork where one is already longer than the other, then there is no penalty, is that right?
So if there is so for example, if the top had 2 blocks and the bottom had just 1 block, then you would get that 1 block penalized.
Okay. All right. Yeah, thanks.
So the weak height is so I'm using blockchain terminology in graph theory. This is the distance from the root is called depth.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm used to blockchain terminology, but I'm always talking about the distance from genesis. So all blocks that have the same distance from genesis are going to, if there's more block at the set distance from genesis, all such blocks are going to receive no reward. So it might be that in a fork there are blocks that that do not have another block at the same depth, and these will not be penalized.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Now, final thing, and this will become obvious, I guess, once I show this, is unacceptable blocks. So if we see a long fork, then we can realize it obviously is the result of malicious behavior. So with high probability, this is the result of malicious behavior. And we can identify such blocks and ignore them completely. This is what you see at the bottom here. We're looking at the canonical path. The canonical path is a longest path, a longest chain in some single color. And we use a consistent branch choice. I don't want to get into this unless someone is particularly interested. And unacceptable blocks, we call a block unacceptable if it is too far from the canonical path. And by far, I mean the following. If you look at the block B at the figure here, then you see that B1 is the last block on the canonical path that is a parent of B. and B2 is the first block on the canonical path that is a child, a descendant of B. And now we look at this cycle of B, B1, B prime, B prime prime, B double prime, and B2. If the number of blocks in this cycle is greater than some parameter NL, then we say that B is unacceptable. And if a block is unacceptable, we ignore it completely. Not only it does not receive a reward, so it was penalized, but also it does not affect the reward of acceptable blocks. So this block B is simply ignored. In summary, colordag, 3 techniques. We color blocks to remove the effect of network latency, so we don't have natural forks of honest blocks. We use symmetric penalty because we realize we cannot identify an attacker block, not dishonest block, but we still want to penalize, and we showed that the symmetric penalty is enough to disincentivize an attack. And we use unacceptable blocks when we can obviously identify a block that was generated by misbehavior. Now, what does all this give us? This gives us something that we call an epsilon sure Nash equilibrium. This is a new solution concept. Let me convince you that it is useful. An epsilon sure Nash equilibrium means that it is a Nash equilibrium in almost all histories. Let me break this down. So history is an execution of the system. And this means that the scheduler chooses the miner sizes over time, so who is in the system and how much miner power they have. Then the scheduler chooses who is going to win to get the opportunity to generate a block in each round. And this is done uniformly at random in proportion to each miner's computational power chosen in the previous step. And then the attacker chooses a strategy. And the attacker's strategy is actually based on the scheduler choices. The attacker knows when everyone is going to generate a block. It can also control network propagation time. Now, this is an extremely strong attacker. This is a very weak model, and we're going to prove everything even in this model. And note, why is this so strong? Because the attacker takes no risk, right? The attacker knows whether an attack is going to succeed, whether it's going to be lucky. Now, each history has a probability. The probability comes from the scheduler's random coins. And what we're looking is for an equilibrium in 1 minus epsilon, so in almost all histories. And we'll show that colordag is an epsilon Nash equilibrium. So almost always, colordag is a strict equilibrium. So rather than always being in almost Nash equilibrium, we're saying colordag almost always is a strict Nash equilibrium. Now, to prove this, we're going to first define what a safe history is. So safe history up to some time, Tmax, we have to bound time because in an infinite execution, every bad thing is going to happen. So up to some time Tmax, we need 3 conditions to hold. First of all, in all subintervals with enough blocks, so more than NL blocks of one color, a majority of those blocks is honest. This is requirement 1 of a safe history. Requirement 2, over long enough intervals, the fork rate is low. Condition number 3, over long enough intervals, we have at least some bounded ratio of blocks of each single color. So SH2, just to be clear, SH2 talks about the fork rate of a specific color. And SH3 talks about, says that we would get enough instances of each color if we look at a long enough period. And our first proposition is saying that for all positive epsilon and sufficiently large Tmax, there exists constant. We talked about NL, this length for unacceptability, and NC, the number of colors, and their additional constants, parameters for the low fork rate, etc. So for all positive epsilon and sufficiently large Tmax, there exist constants of the protocol such that the probability of what we define as the safe history is at least 1 minus epsilon. And I can show you an example with a known vagus that is not vaguely true. So obviously, if Tmax is not large enough, then the requirements are just vaguely true. But we have practical examples, or non-vagus examples, I mean. So now that we know what histories we're looking at safe histories that happen with overwhelming probability. Then given a safe history, all honest blocks are acceptable because the attacker cannot form a long enough path to implicate an honest blocks. It cannot create a long path such that there will be more than NL blocks where the honest block is on the wrong side. And for every honest penalty, so if the attacker wants to cause a penalty and prevent a reward from an honest block, at least one attacker block is going to also be penalized. So the symmetric penalty is actually symmetric. This is because there is hardly any forking of honest blocks. And the implication is that the best response, the strict best response in a safe history is to follow the protocol, which is what we wanted. The next step is going back to the desiderata or requirements of a ledger. So first of all, to define the ledger, we'll use a simple choice here. We just pick one color for the transactions. And so say the blue blocks contain the transactions. And we'll look at the longest chain of blue blocks and that's it. This will provide the ledger. This means that we don't place transactions on other blocks. You could use more fancy constructions that would work equally well. This is not the point of this work. So consistency follows from requirements 1 and 2 of a safe history. Quality also from 1 and 2. And growth, we also need enough blocks of each color. So it follows from all 3 requirements. But we also need another requirement, and this is new, and this is revenue consistency. We need not only that once a transaction is placed on the blockchain, it remains there forever. We also need to show that the revenue does not change. So if a party received a reward, that reward will remain forever. We will not find out 2 weeks from now that the reward we got today is invalid. This follows from SH1 and SH2, and I just wanted to point out why this is suddenly necessary. So in previous work, the longest chain immediately implied the revenue of each party. You realize what the ledger is, and immediately you also know the rewards. And in our DAG construction, suddenly the reward is also affected by blocks that are not on the main chain because of unacceptability and penalties. So we need to require this explicitly and also prove that explicitly. And with this, I conclude. So we talked about blockchain, the requirements for consistency, quality, and growth. And we talked about security with incentives. This is a new thing a new concept used for blockchain protocols that is new. This is not the classical approach for distributed system security. We talked about selfish mining, why an honest majority is not enough, and how to find optimal attacks using Markov decision processes and reinforcement learning. And then I talked about getting better resilience with colordag, using 3 techniques. We color blocks and we get rewards by the individual miners. We use symmetric penalty to penalize against blocks where we don't know who's the attacker, and we ignore completely unacceptable blocks, mainly to achieve reward consistency. Finally, I introduced the Epsilon Nash equilibrium solution concept that we use to analyze this. We saw that fruit chain is always almost a Nash equilibrium, whereas colordag is almost always a Nash equilibrium. And we saw very briefly the correctness arguments for safe histories with probability 1 minus epsilon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ittay. This was really interesting. I guess Jiangshan has a question already. I'll go ahead, Jiangshan.
No, I was just trying to say thank you to Ittay. But I do have several things that I may seek for the clarification. Should I start or should we ask others first?
Yeah, maybe you can start with your first question, and in the meanwhile, if there are any questions, they can be typed in the chat or you can raise your hand.
Yeah, sure. So probably this is just for the colordag. So we like you mentioned that the rule still will be the longest chain one, namely we kind of take the longest path in this DAG, right? Mm-hmm. But this DAG is not affected by the color, right? The DAG is extended. I mean, the pointer of each node in the DAG is according to the mining result, not to the color. The color is only assigned after the block is generated randomly. For example, according to the least significant bit, for example. And you also mentioned that one way, well, so the more color we have, the less conflict blocks would be generated for that color. But I don't see the link between this and the attack. So because we still choose the longest chain, so the attacker can still accumulate the blocks of different colors, and that could be of the same branch in the DAG, right? So how different colors could help to prevent the attacker kind of taking the advantage due to, for example, block withholding because of the kind of the advantage in network latency over other honest miners. So this part was not very clear to me.
Okay, thank you. This is an excellent point. So first of all, I mean, I guess you're asking two things here. So in terms of security, in the sense of assuming an honest majority, what is the probability of an attacker to violate the safety guarantees of the system? We are actually not changing much in the following sense. An honest, a majority attacker can still attack the system just as well as in Nakamoto's original, almost just as well as in Nakamoto's original paper. We have an advantage because of coloring only. So the coloring means that even with network latency, we can reduce the fork rate. But I guess what you're hinting to is that you could also reduce the block rate in Nakamoto and get the same result. And yeah, this would work, but this is not the point. This is not the point here. So if you want to talk about better utilizing all colors for transactions and then overcoming such attacks, this goes to the question of how to serialize all transactions in the blockchain and still get the blockchain desiderata. And this is a separate question. We intentionally do not get there. Levenberg and company, I think they were the first to address this, and they have a more recent paper, Sampolinsky and friends in AFT, I think, that show how to serialize all these transactions and address the safety concerns. So what colordag addresses is the incentive aspect. And for incentives, we do overcome any attacker up to 50% because the attacks that were useful per chain, so trying to apply selfish mining like attack per color is not going to yield revenue because the fork would just result in no reward at all.
Right. So even if you are selected because of the longest chain, you may still not get the any revenue if you do double spending because of the different colors of the same height. so that I see. So basically, this, as you said, this is only focusing on how to de-incentivize the attackers to
right,
to leverage smart mining strategy.
right. I mean, maybe I can expand a little bit on this. Just one more word. The data structure is a DAG, but optimally you would get just a single chain. So we don't actually want to use a lot of colors, etc. The best DAG that will result from this is actually just a single chain. And if there are forks, it should be by and large due to misbehavior, and we use all these techniques to avoid them. We're actually not looking to generate a thick DAG like they do in high frequency protocols where the goal is throughput. Here, our best scenario is actually just a very thin DAG, and we use the general graph structure just for disincentivizing attacks.
I see. So I mean, at the beginning, I thought this is super complicated, but then my small understanding of the protocol, it seems to be very simple in terms of the design, the design principle. Yeah. Right.
The implementation is very straightforward. It took a while to get there, but the resultant protocol is straightforward, we believe, including the unacceptability rule. That was the most hairy part. But yeah, the proofs are a bit more elaborate. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to go there.
So are you planning to do any kind of BIP or EIPs for this scheme?
Oh, that's yeah. So this applies as is. This applies to a proof of work blockchain, and Ethereum, I think, is going a different direction. But for any blockchain that is actually proof of work reliant, you get immediate improvement from here. And like I said, it's a very practical design.
Thank you.
I had two questions and you already answered them while answering Jiangshan's questions. First one was about the proof of work. And the second one, I'll maybe repeat that. So overall, for any adversaries that has less than 50% power, the best strategy is just to follow the protocol, right? So there's no like this 25% or something like that.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Right.
So maybe another one. So this is not related to this talk, in fact, but I just wonder, normally when we are designing security protocols, in particular for blockchains, there are kind of too many aspects to consider, and incentive is one of the very complex aspects to analyze during the design process of a protocol. And normally analyzing the incentive requires you, to build up a kind of dedicated game theoretic model to calculate the utility and consider all the possible movements, which is super complicated and difficult to do. So I just wonder, if you know any kind of more streamlined tools or process that one can leverage as a framework to prove the kind of the incentive aspect of a protocol for blockchain.
I think what you said is exactly the point. The key aspect is actually understanding the model. That I think takes that's the hardest step, I think, in this process, because for security we sort of understand exactly what we want, and to realize the incentive and who does what and who's motivated to do what, there's still many open questions. This is a central reason for my excitement about this. And I've only touched here, so to elaborate, I've only touched here on a fairly straightforward world where you have participants in some zero-sum game and everybody wants to get as much as they can. But if you look at, for example, incentive attacks, we recently, or a few years ago now, it's not so recent, introduced a blockchain denial of service attack where an attacker is willing to expend resources in order to move the equilibrium point and attack a system in this way. Looking at the contents of the blockchain and how they affect motivation also changes the model. So the first thing is certainly to understand the model, and then you can start finding the standard tools or describe your own new tools for overcoming that. And this, for me, it happens for every new project again and again.
Yeah, because I was just trying to see if you know any kind of automated tools, like the serial improvers for security protocols, and that will make the work much more easier.
So MDPs are often a good way to go particularly for proof of work mechanisms. Proof of stake is another huge gaping hole of open questions. Mm-hmm. And we are in the process of open sourcing our reinforcement toolbox, Whirlman, for analyzing blockchains. Again, you would require per scenario, you would need to define the entire state space and action space. But then the rest is already built, and you can find optimal attacks and hence thresholds for security, bounds for security.
All right. I think if there are no more questions, we look to conclude the session here. Thank you very much, Ittay, for your very interesting talk. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I hope to see you in the next seminar.
Thank you, Ittay.
Thank you. Bye.